third video in the series on intervals. In the first video we defined a few basic terms. In the second video we identified a set of intervals that we gave specific names to, and we observed that to label intervals we need to first of all be able to determine the number of half steps in the interval, and secondly that we need to be able to determine the number of lines and spaces involved in the interval, and those two pieces of information in combination enable us to give the interval a specific name. In this video we are going to find out what happens if we move beyond the set of intervals that you know. Now, the set of intervals you know I've represented in this sort of diagram over here. This is the number of half steps. This is the name that we give to the interval, assuming, of course, that it really is a third or a fourth. What we will discover today is that sometimes you can have intervals that have 4 half steps but are not called a major third. So it is not possible for me to tell you that every time you have 4 half steps you will have a major third. That is not a true statement. You will have a major third if on paper the notes are a third apart. There are 3 lines and spaces involved in writing out the interval on paper. If that is the case and it has 4 half steps, then it is a major third. Now, if what I just said was a little bit confusing, I think it will make more sense when I cover the next part of this video. So, we have identified certain intervals, as I say, displayed on this chart. What happens if we find that the interval we are looking at does not match the chart in the way that we would expect? Let's look at that. What happens, for example, if we have this interval, F to C sharp? Well, first of all, we would do exactly what we would do when approaching any interval. We would count the number of lines and spaces because we want to get a number. We want to know what is the number of this interval. So we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 lines and spaces involved in this interval. So it is some kind of fifth. Whatever else it may be, it is some kind of fifth. Alright? Now what we do is we count up the number of half steps. That's the other piece of information we always want to know with intervals. What is the number of lines and spaces? Give it a number. How many half steps are there between the 2 notes? So let's find the 2 notes over here. We have the notes F going to C sharp, right? From F to C sharp. Let's count the number of half steps. So starting on F, as we move through the half steps, we'll count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 half steps. So we'll make a note. 8 half steps. So what do we know? We know this is some kind of fifth. We counted the number of lines and spaces. We know it has 8 half steps. We say to ourselves, well, we know a fifth. We know a particular type of fifth. We know the fifth that is called a perfect fifth. We have it on our chart. However, the perfect fifth that we know has 7 half steps. Now this has 8. So at that point we are stuck. We could identify it if it was a perfect fifth because it would be a fifth. We would get the number 5 and we would have 7 half steps. We would say, great, it's a perfect fifth. But in this case, we do not have the right number of half steps. It cannot be a perfect fifth because it does not fit all the criteria. So what do we do? Well, that takes us to these 2 diagrams that I've written above the chart here. What these numbers or what these letters represent are the names that we give to intervals. So in the middle we have P for perfect and we have M for major. Now these are the names of intervals that we know. These are the names that occur on the chart of intervals we know. We have perfect intervals and we have major intervals, and we know the number of half steps for each of those. What happens though is that sometimes intervals like the one we're looking at here are bigger or smaller. They have more half steps, or as we'll see in a moment, less half steps than the number of half steps necessary for us to use the terms that we know in this chart. So we go to these two diagrams and we say to ourselves, okay, what do we know? We know a perfect fifth should have 7 half steps. We know we have a fifth, so we're going to start from what we know, the perfect fifth, and we're going to see how many more half steps does this have than the perfect fifth that we expect. Well, it has 8 half steps. The perfect fifth would have 7 half steps, so this is one larger. We move up the chart. This must be an augmented fifth. Now just take 30 seconds to say P stands for perfect, A is augmented, D is diminished, M is major, A is augmented, lowercase m is minor, D is diminished. These are the names that we have for intervals. The names are major, minor, augmented, diminished, and perfect. Those are the 5 names that we can give to intervals. So the question is, which of those names should be given to this interval? It is a fifth, so it gets the number 5, but it has 8 half steps, which is 1 more than a perfect, so it must be augmented. Let's look at a couple of other examples, and you'll see how this plays out. What if we look at this interval? This is G to B flat. Again, let's play it out. Let's do everything just as we would expect it to happen, and let's figure out what we know and what we don't know, where we need to go and look at the various charts. So let's start as we always should. First thing, get the number. What is the number of this interval? If I count from G to B flat, I'm looking at the total number of lines and spaces used. 1, 2, 3. This is some kind of third. It has 3 lines and spaces. I know that much. I then count to myself, I say to myself, I need to count the number of half steps. How many half steps between G and B flat? If I locate G on the keyboard, and now I'm going to count half steps until I get to B flat. 1, 2, 3. 3 half steps. Now I say to myself, I know a third. I know that there is a major third, and it has 4 half steps. I know that because I have learned this chart, right? So I've learned this chart, and I know that a major third has 4 half steps. But this third, it's definitely a third, but it only has 3 half steps. So I go to here, and I say, I knew a major third that had 4 half steps. The one I'm looking at has 3, so it must be a minor third. This has got to be a minor third. Now hopefully you can tell that knowing this is a key element. You have to know quickly and without really having to think about it how many half steps the perfect and major intervals have. If you know that, it's very easy then to think of these charts and go up or down to realize basically that if you have a perfect interval that's 1 half step bigger, it becomes augmented. If you have a perfect interval that's 1 half step smaller, it becomes diminished. If you have a major interval that's 1 half step bigger, it becomes augmented, and so on. Notice that major intervals can in fact even be 2 half steps smaller. You can end up with a diminished interval that otherwise in our referencing intervals we would think of as being major. I can show you an example of that. It might be helpful just so you can see it. We'll work it through. Let's say we have an F to an A double flat. Right? Seems pretty initially tricky, but the first thing we do, as always, is we look up what is the total number of lines and spaces involved. 1, 2, 3. Some kind of third. Doesn't matter what else we end up figuring out on the piano keyboard or wherever, this is some kind of third. Now let's identify the 2 notes. We have the note F And we've got the note A double flat. What is an A double flat? Well, A, 1 flat, 2 flat. A double flat. It's another way that we are going to refer to the white note G. But right now, on paper, it is an A double flat. So we say to ourselves, okay, how many half steps between F and A double flat? 1, 2. 2 half steps. We have a third, but it has 2 half steps. We follow exactly the same process that we always have. We say to ourselves, okay, what's the third we know? We know a major third, and it has 4 half steps. We just know that. We have learned that. A major third has 4 half steps. So we say to ourselves, now how many half steps does the third we're looking at? Oh, it has 2 half steps. That's 2 less. So I find major on the 2 charts that we use, and I go back 2 half steps. Diminish. This is a diminished third. Now some of you might say to me, well, it's the same as F and G. That would be a major second. Those of you who maybe have figured this out or have had a bit more experience with this, or are just thinking ahead, you might say, yeah, you know, it has all the criteria. That is, F to G is a major second. F to G is a major second. F to A double flat is a diminished third. Now, you may say to me, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you ever write that? Well, again, there may be circumstances in music theory that in order to keep our music theory consistent, we have to write things on paper in a way that seem unusual or even unnecessary, but are necessary to keep the theory that we're looking at consistent, to keep our concept and idea of music theory and the whole realm of music theory, to keep it moving consistently, to keep the statements I make to you consistent. And so sometimes we will have situations where a third is referred to as a diminished third, even though there would be other ways those 2 notes could be written, and it would be given a different name if indeed they were written differently. So, hopefully that has not confused you. The bottom line is that you can now figure out any interval simply by knowing this set of intervals, that is to say the major and perfect intervals and the number of half steps, and then figuring out whether the interval you're looking at is bigger or smaller, and how much bigger or smaller is it. And as long as you know that the interval you're looking at is bigger, you move up the chart, or if you know it's smaller, you move down the chart. And remember where you start with a perfect interval or a major interval and move accordingly from there. If there's any part of this video you are unclear on, please go back and watch it again. Make sure that you are absolutely clear on how to figure out any interval. And in class, we of course will be looking at some of these in detail and putting a few more examples up onto the board. You'll be working with some examples, and we'll kind of see how all of this works together. Bottom line, in summary, you need to know this chart. You need to make sure that you know the perfect and the major intervals and how many half steps. And then that information in combination with these 2 charts or diagrams will enable you to figure out any other interval that you might encounter. Thank you.